So sorry I can't see everybody, but welcome to my final tour of this long 5-year project. I remember, I do this all the time, but I was thinking that it would be a really small group on the last tour. And so I'm really happy to see so many people I know, and I'm really grateful for you to come out today. So for those of you who don't, well, first of all, how many, this is your first time here? Okay, so about half, okay. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about today a monumental chapter in Canadian history, and yet one that's probably one of the least well known. But, and I emphasize Canadian history, even though it's Chinese Canadian. But before I do that, before I tell you that really big story, I want to tell you, hello. I want to tell you a couple of other stories first to set the context. So my name is Catherine Clement, and despite my last name, I'm half Chinese. My mother was Chinese. My father was a white Swedish-Irish boy from the Alberta prairies. And they didn't stay together, so I grew up mostly in white culture. And interestingly, it was, my father served in the Second World War, and he served in Bomber Command, which any of you know anything about the Second World War, that's where the highest death rate was in Bomber Command. And he died young, and he was very troubled. He drank a lot, he was violent, and he left this world rather early. And for the longest time, I resented him, to be quite frank. But many years later, probably around 2000, I started to become interested in his story and what was it like for a 20-year-old farm boy from a poor, remote area of Alberta to find himself in a war, losing all his buddies, flying over the skies of Europe when you're getting bombed? What was the experience of war? And that led me on a journey where I began to do a lot of research. I began to listen to a lot of documentaries of people who were like eyewitnesses to these events. And I wasn't so much interested in the dates that certain things happened. I was interested in the experience of those historical moments. So fast forward to about 2009, and there was a project that was being done, which they were asking for volunteers to interview the last of the World War II veterans. And I thought, here is my chance to actually talk to some of these men who are still alive. They're old men by now, 80s and 90s, and to learn about that experience of being in war as a young kid. And so I put up my hand for Vancouver. I did several interviews, even with German soldiers. But interestingly, the first person they assigned me to was a fellow named Leonard Wong. And that interview with that Chinese veteran changed the course of my life and woke me up to something I never knew about and had never heard in school. And in fact, my first glimpse of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the period of exclusion was through the many veterans that I ended up interviewing over a period of 10 to 12 years. So that's partly the connection to this. Is in looking for my father's story, I found the story related to my mother and my Chinese background. So that's the first story. The second story is in 2019, I was finishing a big project, and I was thinking of what I wanted to do next. And I realized that the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Exclusion Act was coming up in 2023. And interestingly, in all the interviews I did, the Exclusion Act never came up very much in these interviews with these war veterans who had lived through it. And I thought, maybe it wasn't that significant, because why did we never talk about it? And so I had an idea. I thought, well, I'm going to go when I've been interviewing people, I keep on seeing all these papers, these kind of head tax certificates and documents. And I thought, well, the least I could do is to go out, find as many of these, because they actually, very, very few are in public archives. Most of the surviving documents are in family boxes, in closets, and drawers. So I thought the first thing I could do is kind of as a gift to the community is find as many of these as I can, scan them, and then try to get the story of the person who appears on that document and try to find out what they went through during the period of exclusion. And to be quite honest with you, I thought I was just going to put on a photography exhibition. I was going to call it Portraits of Exclusion, and it would just be arrays of all these faces and the stories that go with them. So I was in for a big surprise. I started to collect these. So these are only some of them. There's more in the other room, and there's a whole bunch of almost 300 still waiting to be processed. But I thought it was going to be relatively easy. And the surprise, as I said, this was a monumental chapter in Canadian history, unprecedented, nothing like it before, and hopefully nothing like it since. But when I went out to collect these things, I was astonished that I would say about 95% of the families who handed me one of these could tell me nothing about what that person had gone through during the dark years of exclusion, which lasted almost a quarter century. And yet they were directly tied to this story. Their grandfathers, their fathers, and mothers. And I realized this was not going to be an easy project. And that in fact, if I really wanted to understand that human experience of exclusion, we were going to have to do something completely different to find it. We were going to have to excavate these stories. And we call it the paper trail for a reason. Because this intergenerational silence, the one generation who went through it never talked about it with the next generation, meant that we had to find other ways to dig up the story. So thank God I started in 2019 to work on this, because we wound up, I hired a Chinese researcher to work with me, and we got UBC history students involved, and we started to comb. We went through all the issues of the Chinese newspapers between 1923 and 1947 when this story takes place. And we were looking day by day, looking for small stories that revealed what happened to people. Then we did that with the English newspapers across Canada. And then we started to go into the archives of the different clan associations here, looking what was in their scrapbooks, what could we find there. We went through trial records. We requested coroner's reports. We talked to families and looked at letters and cards that they may have. We asked the government to release to us, now that it's the 100th anniversary coming up, all the records that related to this exclusion period, because they had been held under lock and key for 100 years. And then there were whatever breadcrumbs of stories that families could tell us. Like the person in Moose Jaw who said, my grandfather never talked about this, but the only time he said something was he remembers being in Moose Jaw and all the white people wearing a button that said purely English, and how it made the Chinese community feel there, big buttons on their lapels. So these little breadcrumbs of paper all together help us find this story and what happened to people. And it was far more devastating than I had ever imagined. And we're going to look at some of those stories as we go through. And so silence is one theme that comes up a lot in this work. The other thing is these on the panel, if you haven't read it, but basically the Chinese hold this unique distinction in Canadian history. One, they're the only group to ever have been marked with exclusion. And the second, and this is what we found out through the research, it was actually Library and Archives Canada that told us that no other immigrant group in Canadian history was as heavily documented as the Chinese. So what was the thing that we hated the most, though, are the things that help lead us back into this story. So there's this irony that all this paper is what actually allows us to follow this paper trail back into this story. So it's interesting how there's so many silver linings to the very, very things we hated. So I'm not going to go into a lot of depth into the Exclusion Act. It's dry. It's 15 pages of legal stuff. But I'm going to tell you two things about it because they reemerge over and over again in the exhibition. The first is that the Act had kind of two main things you need to know about it. One was exclusion, basically an outright ban, and the second on Chinese only, and the second was something called this mass mandatory registration. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. And it doesn't seem that harmful, but in fact, it's one of the things that just sent the community spinning. But if we look at those newspapers up there, those are actual newspapers. You look at the one on the left. This is the actual headline from the Victoria Daily Times, November 11th, 1922. And what was so clear in those days is there was no couching your words about what your intention was. And it says, must bar Oriental completely to save BC for the white race. And on the third paragraph down, which I've unfortunately had to cover over, but it says total exclusion of Chinese, Japanese, Hindus, and all other Asiatics was the wish. It was the wish of British Columbia in particular. And one of the things that I learned from the research we did over these years, is that the worst of racism actually came out of this province. This was like the deep south of Canada, the Mississippi of Canada. And we don't even show you half of the things that we found that are just so shocking to read. But that was the wish of the British Columbia government. They were the biggest advocates for exclusion. They were also the biggest advocates for the head tax, which came before exclusion and was a form of exclusion. It was designed to push the railroad workers out that were here, the Chinese, and to make sure for sure they don't bring their families over. So exclusion in some ways begins on the first head tax in 1885. But so that was November 11th, 1922. The Act goes in very symbolically on July 1st, 1923. So Canada Day, or Dominion Day, it was called then, is purposely chosen to bring in the Act. But the Act ends up being only Chinese. And there's this sense in the community, like, why just us? It probably would have been easier for the Chinese community if all Orientals or Asiatics were engulfed in this law, but it only is the Chinese. And there's this sense you've already been after, like, we were the only ones to ever have the head tax. And now this, like, why are we at the very bottom of the barrel? Why are we the most undesirable group to you? What have we done? And it's interesting, we discovered, again through the paper trail newspapers, is that the community called it the Cruelty Act at first, not the Exclusion Act, but the Cruelty Act. Interesting choice of words. And so the community actually tried very hard to fight exclusion. And we find all sorts of newspaper reports where they're gathering and meeting and they're trying to pull together some arguments so that the government will at least soften the law. And that doesn't work. And in May 1923, so just a couple months before it goes law, we find an article where a whole bunch of Chinese from all over the country, and remember in those days you had to go by train everywhere. The number of them go to Ottawa and they have a little report with them. It's 18 pages long. And it puts out all these arguments and recommendations. And the newspaper article says, the senators, so the Senate is where the last, you can make some tweaks to the law. So the senators had a chance to make some tweaks, but the newspaper article says they looked at it, saw it was 18 pages and said, we're not going to bother reading this, and they flipped it. And I think of how soul-crushing that must have been. Like just the indignity of that moment. That fight was over. The law was going to come in. And the next fight, I'm not going to move us around too much because we're a bit big here, but usually I'd be moving us by now. The next fight was, remember I told you there was a registration. So the law said every Chinese in Canada has to register. At first, I remember when I first read that, I thought, that doesn't sound so bad. But what that meant was that if you were, all the people in this room here are all immigrants from China, it meant you'd have to go in and you would be interrogated. You'd have to bring in your papers, you'd have to prove who you were, you'd have to answer a barrage of questions. You had to get your answers right. We discovered again through the paper trail that it was the registration that most freaked out the community. The fear and the fact that you had to register, many people had to register in an RCMP detachment. Like, isn't that just for criminals? And in fact, there's newspaper stories that where the government say, well, we want to fingerprint every Chinese person. So then again, this concern, like, but that's for criminals, isn't it? Like, why are we treating like criminals? There's other headlines out of Regina that says the RCMP to round up all Chinese for photographs and questioning. So no wonder it created such fear. It's just, and what we're going to see as we move to the next room, like what starts to happen, this churning and despair and fear and anxiety and anger that all starts mixing up in this big, big soup. So part of the concern with the registration was just having to ask all these questions, answer all these questions, and if you didn't show up, you could be fined, deported, whatever. The other is that it would also sweep up children born here in Canada. They would be also part of that registration. And so families thought, well, but why? And like, they're Canadian born. Why would they be caught up in this? Why would they also have to be documented? And in the next room, we'll see what happened to Canadian born. So one of the things I just want to point out while we're in this room still. So this is the room where we look at, as This was still a crowdsourced exhibition. So all of these have come in from all parts of Canada, along with some stories where we can. But I just want to point something out here. I'll have to get you to move this so I can show. So here's another interesting fact. So these are different, you'll notice they're different colors. So there are different kinds of what we call CI certificates. A CI certificate just stands for Chinese immigration. And remember when I said there was excessive documentation of Chinese? So the government was constantly creating new kinds of certificates to think like every possible thing they could think of for Chinese, there was a new certificate created. This here is called a CI-5. And a CI-5 is an actual head tax certificate. So this person paid to come into Canada. And you'll notice these early ones don't have any photos. This is 1910. And then we get to 1912, and we see our first photograph. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder what happened there. So two things that we discovered. First of all, in 1910, the federal government introduced for the first time mugshots for the federal prison system. So Kingston Penitentiary was the first time they adopted the mugshot. The next time they adopted the mugshot was for the Chinese. And the first mass use of photo identification in Canada was for the Chinese. And in some ways that makes sense, because if you've ever seen an immigration ledger, you'll see that they'll have a person's name, their height, and eye color, hair color, and then they will have these copious notes about every scar, every pimple, every mole that was on someone's face, because to white immigration officers, we all looked alike, right? And if you describe somebody committed a crime, you say he's 5'3" and whatever. It didn't help. So photo identification was a way to help immigration officers and law enforcement to easily distinguish us. So these were required when these men came in. But when I was saying earlier, there's silver linings to a lot of these things. The silver lining here is that for the first time, like nothing happens to you when you look at those top ones. They're just a certificate. But suddenly, when you see one with a photo, it comes alive. It's a real person looking back at you and is documenting that individuality of each of these people. And what's fascinating is you go through, they're in chronological order by type. You'll see the style change of dress over time. You'll see they're almost all men. There are very, very few women. These brown ones here are called CI-30. These were for merchant class who didn't pay the tax, but there are not too many of them, you'll notice. And when you do see women, you're usually seeing them on those two certificates. So again, these things, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of these issued, and very few survive to this day because they were so hated. And as soon as this was over in 1947, one of the first things people did was to burn those things or rip them up, and understandably so. But the ones that survive are really, really precious. So if any of you have any of these, please do not throw them out. So we're going to keep going down this way. So this is very much the room where we look at the Exclusion Act itself on the panels, and we talk about how the community reacted to it. Now we're going to go to the really individual experience of this law. Here's a little stat for you. The exclusion, which began, as I said, with the first head tax and then rolled up to this huge, complete exclusion in 1923 one of the effects of that is that Chinatowns and just Canadian society, Chinese Canadian society in general, was heavily male dominated. So there were about 35 men, adult men to every adult female. And most of these men were laborers. And what I really learned about the Exclusion Act is how much it's very much a story of class. And what happens to you is based on class. And a little bit of background for some of you not as familiar. So usually when Chinese men were picked to come to Canada, you usually chose your best from your family or from your village to come here because it was damn expensive. You had to pay the head tax, you had to pay their transportation. So you invested in your strongest. You bet on winners because they were to be here to earn money to send back to keep their families alive in China. And so what we've discovered though, so as I said, the act goes in July 1st, 1923. People have 1 year to register. June 30th, 1924 is the date by which all Chinese living here are legally having to register. And what we discovered is what happened in that year, which surprised us. And partly no one remembers this is because everyone that it happened to were men who were here alone. They have no descendants to share this story. So the great thing about going day by day and issue by issue of the newspapers, we found them. And we started to trace back their paper trail to learn more about their story. So one is we start to find letters in the clan associations of men who are begging to go home. Now what's interesting is they're all pretty old. They're usually in their 60s or 70s. And they have these really mournful letters where they're talking about how, I'm spending my whole life in places where I don't belong. And I just want to go home. I don't want to die a ghost in a foreign land. And so what's interesting is a lot of them have been here many, many years by this time. Others who have been here many, many years, we find start to unravel. And we find newspaper reports of men who just kind of lose it. And some of them end up in a place called Essendale, which back then was an insane asylum. It became Riverview for any who are local who know. And this is why I show this photo is that, just backing up a little bit, when we approached the Library and Archives Canada to release all the Exclusion Act records that have been held there, if everybody registered, that means there was a form filled out on every Chinese person who was alive back then. They all had to bring in a picture. So where are those records? We want them. We deserve to have them now, 100 years later. They belong to our community. And I joke, but this is actually absolutely true, that they gave me an early copy. So they gave us, publicly they allowed the access when just at the time we were opening the show, but they gave me a copy 2 years earlier. And they gave it to me as 56,000 JPEGs in no particular order. And, but again, there's always a silver lining to every time something goes wrong, there's a silver lining to it. And in that case, as I was hunting for somebody, I would stumble upon somebody else. And one day I'm flipping through, actually using my mouse, flipping through, and I come across this picture and it stops me in my tracks. And I look at this man and I see he's hunched over and he's thin and he can't make eye contact with the camera. And I discover his name was Tai Hing Gom, and he was 42. And this picture was taken in Essendale Insane Asylum. But what's even more interesting is that he arrived there on July 13th, 1923, 13 days after the act goes in. And then I start flipping through the Essendale files, and I find there's a number of other men in that 1 year who are brought to their knees because of this act. And what we discover they have in common is that they're all laborers. They're all guys that came over here with this kind of dream of making it rich, but they basically hardly eke out a living. They go through feast and famine. They've spent long times unemployed. They're separated from their families. Most never even get to go back once for a trip. They're dealing with all this racism around them and this hostility towards them. That hostility like you see on those newspaper headlines. Yet somehow they keep going. And when this act comes in, this is what takes them down. And nobody remembers that, except finding it through the paper trail. And it's heartbreaking. And what's even more heartbreaking for these guys who end up in Essendale is that in our culture back then is you were afraid of someone who developed mental illness. So they were often then, everybody pulled back from them. And we actually got his files. We found that he had actually been in Canada since he was 27. And he would have come over as a healthy man, able to make money, strong, hopefully mentally capable. But we find that some of these guys go silent. They don't talk. The paper says, oh, we know nothing about them. He hasn't spoken since he's been here. And then we also learned that many years later, 1935, during the Depression, a whole bunch of them were dumped out of Essendale, put onto a ship, and then sent back to China. And yet even their own notes say we know nothing about him. He hasn't spoken. And in his case, nobody ever we found his files, but nobody ever came to visit him. So he was totally alone. So no wonder he looks like that. But in some ways, he was slightly better off than the many men that we found in the newspapers who took their lives. And all over Canada, but mostly in British Columbia. And we also, some of them leave notes. And it's interesting, we see this expression used in some of those suicide notes where they'll say, I've grown tired of life. But it's interesting that with all of them, there's this whole slew of them that take their lives in this one period between the act coming in and the registration. And so this Bachelor's Alley is dedicated to some of those stories. And as I said, they have no one to remember they even existed. So the greatest privilege of doing this exhibition in some ways was to actually find their stories and to remind people they were here. So with the registration, we have a map here which shows the breakdown of where people registered. And you'll see of the almost 56,000 who registered across Canada, the bulk of them are actually in British Columbia, over 31,000. And that partly explains why BC was the biggest advocate for the Exclusion Act, because there was more of them here. And if you fear something and there's more of it around you, you're going to push a little harder. This wall here, so one of the things that I love about, like, not just history, but about exhibition design is how do you convey an idea through design, right? And so with this wall, which was really, really hard to put up because of the symmetry, I wanted to convey that notion of excessive documentation. So you see it in that room, but you see it also in this room, and using kind of the devices by which governments organized information or recorded information. But on these walls here is really, remember I said everybody had to register, and that included Canadian-born children. This is what happens to them. Now it just looks like a document, but if we look at it carefully, it's called a CI-45. So remember I said there are all these different CIs, CI-5, CI-18, CI-24, goes on and on. So the CI-45 is invented in 1923-24. And so this is one of my favorite in terms of how he looks. So this little guy, he is born in Nova Scotia. His parents register him before the deadline, so they leave it quite close to the end. And this is what's interesting, is that the families did not register their children until almost the end, because they were still hoping they wouldn't have to. We're already heavily documented. I don't want my kids to have these documents too. But what's really powerful about it is that this is the Department of Immigration and Colonization, and the bottom, which some of you won't be able to see, but it says this certificate does not establish legal status in Canada. A way to symbolically transfer exclusion to a new generation born here. And these were my first introduction to the Exclusion Act. And I didn't know that at the time. Most of the veterans I spoke to didn't speak to what this was. But it's, one of them finally did and said, I can't imagine my parents getting that and what they thought. And he said it's because of those documents, these CI-45s, that a generation of us decided we wanted to serve in the war, in World War II, as a way to underscore we were Canadian despite this immigration card you gave us. And so those that are marked with a poppy are those who served in the Second World War. And this little fellow here, Quan Louis, the Louis family, London Drugs, IGA, he lost his life in the war for Canada. So it must have been even doubly hard for those parents to not only lose a kid, and there were so few children here in Canada because of exclusion, and then to lose it to a government that considered him an immigrant. And so on this, I don't know if any of you will have time today, but each of these drawers, we have different stories where we're talking about different people's experience of exclusion, what happened to them. We also have just to give you an idea of this breakdown. Thank you. Thank you, Vanna. So that number there, 48,426 are adult males. There are only 1,350 adult females in all of Canada, and 6,204 children under 18. So children are rare because of exclusion. Very few families here. The fellow who initially owned this building had it really good because he had a complete family. So in this section, we look at what I call the survivors of winter. Those who manage, it doesn't mean that they don't face any tragedy or pain, but they manage to hang on. And I like that, I discovered that in Chinese culture, the plum blossom is a really special flower because it blooms first, and it blooms at what is still technically winter. And it can survive. It can stay on the tree in the harshest colds and winds, and it can still keep going. And in many ways, it symbolizes that idea of perseverance, strength, and endurance. And many of us are descendants of those people who were plum blossoms, who managed to hang on through this. Because we have to remember, when this happened, you never knew that if it would ever end, that this might be it. The community starts shrinking, people start leaving. And so each of these is a different story where we look at the impact of exclusion. In this case, we look at somebody who comes here so early, he doesn't even pay the head tax, and who winds up buying a farm and having a family. So he's got a lot of good things going for him. But then the Great Depression hits, and he's wiped out. We look at also young girls who were brought over here. And again, because there were so few females, sometimes these little girls were actually bought from poorer families in China, the Elwin Xie. And they were, and then once they got old, they became servants, basically, and they would be, have to be married off eventually. And this is a story of one of them, but how in some ways, a lot of these women were deeply affected by that experience of being bought, not knowing who they were, what was their real name, and then they're transferred ownership basically to somebody else, and never really spending their whole lives not recovering from that. With this story, we look at a man whose life completely falls apart in 1923. He has a wife, and he has 2 young girls, and his wife has just had the second little girl, and she dies of an infection, and he's running a hand laundry, which is consuming all his time. Back then, they worked incredibly long hours in the hand laundry in Salmon Arm. But because of the Exclusion Act, he could not find another wife in Canada, because there's only 1,300 of them and they're all spoken for. And he cannot bring over another wife. And he has to give up his kids. And yet there's so few kids. So it's just like that. That's the act. That's what it does to people. I mean, fortunately, he doesn't sell them. He puts them in an orphanage, but it's still like this gut-wrenching decision you have to make. And then we look at other situations of mixed race marriages, which were rare, but could be really problematic, especially back then. We look at a man who, during the time of exclusion, only 44 Chinese were exempted to come in. And this handsome man is one of them. And he ends up in Saskatoon. And his family thinks that he felt so privileged to be one of the 44 to come in, that he became this model citizen and just spent all his time teaching, volunteering, doing things in the community, and wins the Order of Canada in the end, just from his good deeds. And then we have another story from the war of a fellow who served in a secret branch called Force 136. These guys were not regular soldiers. They were actually trained in sort of guerrilla warfare for jungle warfare. So this fellow, whose CI is also up on the wall there, CI 45, he winds up serving in the jungles in Borneo. So that these guys are parachuted behind Japanese lines to try to infiltrate the Japanese and do sabotage and espionage. But he comes back extremely sick from being in the jungle. He gets this mixture of malaria and typhus and all sorts of stuff. And so he lives through the war, but dies young, dies in his 30s from what he did in the war. And lastly, these two, and I guess because of time, I won't go into a lot of detail, but these are two men who we found in the penitentiary. So again, those registration records are like a gold mine of stories. And we find these two guys in the penitentiary, and we find that most of the Chinese who are in jail or in Ocala at that time are there for drugs. And again, poverty is a common factor in their lives. So this is a story of one particular fellow, and this is another one that I find interesting because, do you remember I said photos were introduced for Chinese because we all seem to look alike? And this is a story of photo identification that kind of goes wrong. And this fellow we find is, there's a cop a white police officer that shot in the middle of the night, I think like 4 o'clock in the morning actually here in November in Vancouver. And we know we didn't have great street lights back in 1927. And the cop doesn't die right away, so he lingers for about 5 days in hospital, drifting into unconsciousness. And the other police come and say, and all he can say is, it was a Chinaman who shot me. So they come in and they put on his bed an array of photos, and he picks this guy. Says, this is the guy that shot me. But don't forget, it's night. We all look alike, and there's no lights. So this sends this fellow's life into a spiral. He winds up getting arrested. He gets put on trial. They show the photos. By now, the cop is dead. The young sergeant is dead. And that takes the jury 20 minutes, the all-white jury 20 minutes, and they say he's guilty, and he's sentenced to death. And fortunately for him, though, there was an appeal that was done. And partly what came into dispute was the way the photos were used and how reliable it was to use those photos with a man who's dying. And long story short is he goes through another trial and he's found not guilty. So it's interesting. It reminds me, though, again, of this issue around identification and more recent studies that have been done out of the US specifically, particularly the Innocence Project, which shows that often eyewitness identification between races is very, very flawed. There's a high rate of error. If you're white and you see someone who's Black commit a crime or Chinese, you're more likely to misidentify that person. So this kind of rolls back into our use of photos. As you're kind of exiting out of this, I just also wanted to point out these posters. These are from the early 1920s. So while exclusion is happening to Chinese, we have posters that say, Canada, it's mine, the right land for the right man. And the irony of the White Star Line, Canada's call to women, when in fact there were so few Chinese women here, and because of exclusion and the head tax even, it was hard to bring women here. But they were clearly inviting white women to come. So just because of the time, I just wanted to point out quickly this wall. I've been looking at these photos in the archives for years and just love it because it's a bunch of bachelor men reading the newspaper, most of them too poor to afford their own newspaper. So the newspapers, as a public service, would put out the newspapers and you would get these natural gathering spots. And this is here in Vancouver. And so I wanted to recreate something like that here. And this is whole series of newspaper articles most of them in English because of visitors, a whole series of newspaper articles of some of the things they would have been reading at that time. From February 1923, there was a bill, Montreal Daily Star, bill to prevent white girls working in Chinese restaurants. 1925, from the North Bay Nugget, clergymen will not marry white girl to Oriental. That goes into these issues around mixed race marriages. We have a very famous witnesses tell of Janet Smith's fear of Chinese servant. That's a famous murder case here in 1924, going on at the same time of all this, of a young, a rich house where a young Scottish housemaid is working and she is killed, and the Chinese houseboy is blamed. But when the police cannot find enough to convict him, a posse of Scottish, almost like Ku Klux Klan people, kidnap the houseboy and torture him, trying to get him to confess that he actually killed her. So it's a whole, you can look up Janet Smith murder trial, it's fascinating. You know, to the big stock market crash, Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany, the Great Depression starts, Japan invades China, all these things that were happening, and including the war, and some of our young men, like this fellow here, Arthur Jung, who is, for many of you, you may not know, but when the Chinese initially, when the war broke out and they tried to enlist, they were basically shown the back door, like, we're not taking Chinese right now. But when they do enlist, and this is another exhibition we're working on, some of them become superstars in what they do. They are so good at what they do. And this fellow flew for Bomber Command, survived the war. They had a huge death rate in Bomber Command, as I said at the beginning. He actually becomes the top pupil or top pilot in training. So these are just a variety of stories all the way into peace and all the way into citizenship, which happens in 1947. So a very big year is 1947 in that Canadian citizenship is finally granted to Chinese, and the repeal of the Exclusion Act happens that year too. So I want to end on a few things here and a few thoughts, but let me just speak about time again. This really affected me when we found it. Our Chinese researcher found this particular notice in the Chinese Times. It's dated June 29th, 1933, so 10 years in. And I'm always interested in the language that's used here. So on July 1st, 1923, the Canadian government enacted the Chinese Immigration Act with 43 cruel sections. So there's that word again, cruel. Seemingly a lifetime, seemingly in no time. We're now into the 10th year. And there's that sense of time dragging on, right? If this will ever end. We hope all Chinese from all walks of life suspend your work or business on July 1st for collective remembrance. Only together can we remember and make one day undo the burning humiliation and shame. In solidarity, the Chinese Benevolent Association. But these words, burning humiliation and shame. And why I stress that is because as I was working on this project, and I was feeling, I have to confess, I felt really frustrated that how can something, this is like, for Chinese Canadians, this is part of our origin story in this country. It's like talking about Black American history and not talking about slavery, or talking about Indigenous history and not talking about the residential school system. And yet, in our community, this was not talked about. And so I remember in frustration talking to this elderly woman who has since passed away, and I asked her, like, why didn't you say anything to your kids? And she said something that really enlightened me. And she said to the effect that, you know, Catherine, we have been targeted for so long, in the crosshairs of government so long, analyzed and focused on for so long, that the moment we could disappear, the moment we could blend in, we wanted to. And we did it really, really well. And I remember when she told me that, she said all we wanted to do was integrate and blend in. And I forgave her. And later on, I was in Toronto recently, and somebody asked me, because we were talking about the silence, this silence of a community. And one fellow said to me, well, don't you think that was out of love? And I didn't know how to react to it. I said, I don't know. But 2 weeks later, I was in Victoria and I got my answer. I was listening to this white fellow who's married to a Chinese woman. And this white fellow was saying to me, well, you know, my wife's husband, my wife's father would spend hours with me telling me about stuff that had happened during all that period of time. And he said, one day I said to my father, well, why don't you tell Charlene? Like, how come you never told this to Charlene? And he said, I don't want her to know. It's like he was trying to spare her that humiliation and shame. And in some ways, it was like a really loving thing to do, was to not say anything. So, but I think it's time to break that silence. And there's a film that just came out recently that I did some interviews for, and it's called Exclusion Beyond the Silence. And one of the best lines in it is, they were silent, but we don't have to be. So I'm, on a parting note, since this is my last tour here, and I just finished the book on Monday and hit the send button to the publisher, and it'll have more than what's in here, different things. I'm really, really grateful to those of you in here who actually worked with me on this, and almost you co-curated this with me. All the families who went and into their basements and into their attics and into their closets, and then called their aunts and uncles trying to find these pieces of paper to contribute to this show and to this archive. This is your exhibition. I'm just like the coordinator or whatever, but it's really very much this is our community's exhibition, and I could not have done it without the community and without all of you. So please feel like this is yours. And thank you.